Before we begin, I just want to give my disclaimer that this video is not attacking everybody with the same political views as the person I'm covering. If you agree with his position but disagree with his arguments, then you are not somebody I am criticizing with this commentary, and so on and so forth. In this case, the video I'm criticizing is one by Arthur Greenwood, where he attempts to defend the war on drugs. To open with, I just want to discuss this absolutely bizarre point he makes regarding law. For context, he's responding to the objection that drug prohibition is pointless because people are just going to do drugs anyway.
If you buy this argument that banning stuff doesn't work, why have any laws at all? Why not legalize hitmen, since people will just hire them on the black market anyway? Why not legalize child porn, since people will just find it on the dark web anyway? You see how crazy that sounds?
Well, yeah, people would do those anyway. However, if we did not have any laws against them, we would have no means of punishing people who engage in them. We don't have laws against these things because we think writing that you shouldn't do them on a piece of paper is going to prevent people from doing them. But instead, so we have a means to actually deal with people who engage in actions we as a society have determined should not be allowed. That's why we have police to enforce laws. Or are you seriously under the impression that if you call 911 and report a murder, they'll respond with, "But that's illegal! People can't do that!" Mind you, the fact that you'll be punished for violating these laws can act as a deterrent to breaking them. Plus, if we have a means to separate them from the rest of society, we can remove people who commit actions like this and therefore stop them from continuing to do so. However, that's not why they exist in the first place. He even somewhat ends up admitting this when he says that no law is going to completely eradicate all drug use in the United States. He makes essentially the same mistake later on, by the way, comparing legalizing drugs in hopes of preventing a black market from forming to the legalization of human trafficking. The problem with this is that human trafficking is a fundamentally immoral action. Meanwhile, he has not proven that doing drugs is. He has said things like addiction and getting rich off of distributing harmful substances are immoral, but nothing about actually doing the drugs themselves is declared immoral. And that may sound like a minor difference, but it's incredibly important if you want to compare drug use to, off the top of my head, human trafficking.
The liberal media wants you to think that millions and billions of innocent black men get arrested every day just for having a dime bag of weed.
I am forced to agree with him. I don't believe billions of people are arrested every day in the United States, given the US population is only about 341 million at time of recording.
The people who get arrested on drug charges are almost always dealers. Not users, dealers. People who profit off the destruction of lives and communities and families.
Source please, not even saying you're wrong, would just like some evidence. I also just want to take a moment to highlight this hypothetical he poses about two different worlds, one where drugs are illegal and one where drugs are legal. He then asks, in what society would you be more likely to use drugs? And obviously, it does make more logical sense to do drugs in the world where they're legal. The problem with this is people who become drug addicts don't tend to do so because they logically thought over the consequences of their actions, did a cost-benefit analysis, and determined it to be a rational move. I want to point out, one of his examples of a deterrent is that it would cost more to do drugs in a world where they're illegal, even though one of the groups most at risk for drug addiction is homeless people. Members of society well known for not having very much income in the first place.
Another problem is that legalizing something normalizes it. When something's illegal, a few people still do it, but they're quiet about it.
You know High Times magazine started in 1974, right? 40 years before Colorado became the first state to legalize marijuana for recreational use. I need to note that distinction real quick because later on in the video he says California legalized marijuana in 1996.
When California legalized weed in 1996,
but that was only for medicinal use, not recreational use. I mention this because he references this while discussing how legalization actually made the black market for marijuana larger.
Cannabis crimes increased. According to LA police, the amount of black market weed rose 166% after weed was legalized. Recent data shows that only about a sixth of all the weed in California is legal.
But there's a difference between legalizing something for medicinal use and legalizing it for recreational use, and that is going to have an impact on if a black market for it exists. And by the way, I checked his source. Most of the crimes being referenced were smuggling to states where it's illegal. To quote from the article in question, this troubling event touches on one of the several underlying reasons as to how cannabis's more dubious markets are managing to survive despite legalization, as recent data suggests that California produces nearly 5 times the amount of cannabis as it legally consumes. And the off-state smuggling business that could be created by such a surplus can only be strengthened by the drug's industrialization. As former dealers and growers fail to keep up with the marketing and brick-and-mortar convenience of fast-growing commercial options such as NETA, they naturally attempt to go where their prime competition cannot, packing up thousands of dollars worth of leaves and shipping them out of state. It appears the problem is more the criminalization of the drug in other states, as opposed to the legalization of it in specific ones. Yet his misunderstanding of how prohibitions on things actually work is a bit of a consistent problem if you haven't noticed. Here's another example.
It's the exact same stupid argument that leftists make about abortion. If we ban abortion, women will just get abortions on the black market. Okay, maybe a few will, but how many women are really willing to risk being convicted of murder?
Roughly the same amount as would have gotten abortions anyway, according to the data.
And where do you even go to get these black market abortions?
What do you mean by where do you go? You do know what self-induced abortions are, right? I won't be going into detail in this commentary because it is both incredibly gross and not really all that relevant. But before abortion was made legal, there were a lot of different methods women would use to terminate a pregnancy that all boiled down to basically just using household items to intentionally induce a miscarriage. This also means the very next thing he says regarding this topic.
Do you really think millions of women will risk entering the criminal underworld?
Because they're not entering any sort of criminal underworld. They're using knitting needles and in some cases just deliberately falling down. Might I remind you, the slang term for this form of abortion is coat hanger abortions. And who exactly made those part of the criminal underworld? Joan Crawford?
No wire hangers ever!
And yes, he also has a section of the video discussing alcohol prohibition. Let's take a quick look at that.
It is not true that the prohibition didn't work. It did work. According to Dr. Blocker in the American Journal of Public Health, once prohibition became the law of the land, many citizens decided to obey it. Prohibition did work in lowering per capita consumption. We know this because there was a decrease in deaths from alcohol abuse and arrests for drunkenness. Even after prohibition ended, people had been socialized to drink less alcohol. So, per capita consumption remained at less than half the level of pre-prohibition America.
Okay, a couple of problems here. First off, yes, it is true that per capita alcohol consumption did initially decrease during the early years of Prohibition. But alcohol consumption rates had been decreasing since 1910, so even if Prohibition had no effect, assuming that trend remained consistent, we would see a drop in overall per capita alcohol consumption. And consumption rates reached their pre-Prohibition levels way quicker than you say, with the number of gallons of alcohol consumed per capita surpassing what it was in 1918 as early as 1923. By the way, I decided to read Blocker's article, and yeah, you're leaving out several very important nuances. The biggest one being that alcohol prohibition was nothing more than a continuation of several already existing movements within society. As he puts it, historians have shown, however, that national prohibition was no fluke, but rather the fruit of a century-long series of temperance movements springing from deep roots in the American Reform tradition. Furthermore, Americans were not alone during the first quarter of the 20th century in adopting prohibition on a large scale. Other jurisdictions enacting similar measures included Iceland, Finland, Norway, both Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, Canadian provinces, and Canada's federal government. A majority of New Zealand voters twice approved national prohibition but never got it. As a result of 100 years of temperance agitation, the American cultural climate at the time prohibition went into effect was deeply hostile to alcohol, and this antagonism manifested itself clearly through a wave of successful referenda on statewide prohibition.
It is true that people's behavior is downstream from culture, but on the other hand, politics can influence culture. The law can govern people's behavior. That's why we have the law in the first place.
But again, that attitude is totally contradicted by the article you cite, which essentially says that any sort of decreased drinking seen during Prohibition was just an extension of a cultural attitude against alcohol at the time. That's actually what a large chunk of Blocker's paper is about. How cultural shifts led to Prohibition seeming like a good idea to the American public, and how during Prohibition, people changed their minds on the topic. I guess this also begs the question of what do you mean by Prohibition worked? Because if alcohol consumption decreased because of things unrelated to Prohibition, that's not really an example of Prohibition itself achieving its goal. That's its goal being achieved because of other factors. What you're doing is just a massive correlation-causation fallacy.
Going back to drugs, maybe the only reason that drugs are still so common is because our war on drugs hasn't been harsh enough. In Singapore, drug dealers are often executed. And sure enough, Singapore has one of the lowest levels of drug abuse in the world. In the UK, 1.8% of people use ecstasy. In Singapore, it's only 0.003%. In the UK, 0.9% of people use opiates. In Singapore, it's only 0.005%.
Again, sat down and read the article, you're leaving a bunch of stuff out. In this case, that Singapore's policy involves more than just blanket prohibition. Singapore pursues a comprehensive national strategy to combat the scourge of drugs, comprising a high-profile public education campaign, treatment and rehabilitation of drug offenders, as well as strict laws and stiff penalties against those involved in the drug trade. Public education against drug abuse starts in schools. For abusers, our approach is to try hard to wean them off drugs and deter them from relapsing. They are given 2 chances in a drug rehabilitation center. If they go through counseling, kick their drug habit, and return to society with useful skills, they will not have any criminal record. Those who are still addicted go to prison, where they are put on general rehabilitation programs to help them reintegrate into the community. Strong community support against drug abuse has been critical to our fight against drugs. Singapore society resolutely rejects drug abuse. Several voluntary welfare organizations run halfway houses to help recovering addicts adjust back into society. Many employers also come forward to offer reformed drug addicts employment opportunities.
There's a certain cultural taboo about breaking the law. People are afraid to be seen as criminals or get fired or get arrested.
That very much depends on context. While yes, there are communities where breaking the law is incredibly frowned upon, there are also communities where breaking the law is considered not a big deal or even completely acceptable and encouraged. John McWhorter noted in 2011 how the war on drugs had a particularly disastrous effect on the black community. he himself is black for the record, because it made many black people go to jail for breaking nonsensical laws, turning them into essentially victims. The war on drugs makes spending time in prison a badge of honor. To black men involved in the drug trade, enduring prison time, regarded as an unjust punishment for merely selling people something they want with some justification, is seen as a badge of strength. The ex-con is a hero rather than someone who went the wrong way. In the 1920s, before the war on drugs, black Americans, regardless of class level, did not view black ex-cons as heroes.
Let's imagine that you legalize cocaine so that you can regulate it and prevent fentanyl from getting in. That might actually cause an increase in fentanyl deaths.
Anything might cause anything else. Do you have any actual evidence to back up your claim? Well, spoilers, he doesn't. And he does the same sleight of hand later regarding getting drug addicts to seek help, by the way. Saying prohibition could lead to that.
But also, the fact that addicts will be ashamed and afraid could actually make them more likely to get help.
As if saying something could lead to something else is the same as arguing that it will. Again, anything could do anything else. That doesn't mean anything on its own. So, final thoughts? This video did not argue its case very well. You can say many things, but it was not based in reality. Good night and good luck.